This podcast contains adult content and discussions of first-time sexual experiences. Listener discretion is advised. Some stories may include themes that are sensitive or triggering for some audiences. There are first times we celebrate. The first kiss, the first date, the first time falling in love. And then there are first times we rarely talk about. The ones we hide. The ones we carry quietly. The ones that leave us asking questions about who we are and what we are capable of. Welcome to Sexual Encounters, the very first time. I'm Mary Jane. This episode is called The First Lie. Because sometimes a first time isn't about sex itself. Sometimes it's about crossing a line, a secret, a betrayal, a moment that changes how we see ourselves or someone else. For some people, it begins with a text message. For others, an emotional connection, a kiss, a hookup, a relationship outside the relationship. And while infidelity is often discussed in terms of blame and judgment, the reality is usually complicated. It's often tangled up with unmet needs that were never spoken aloud. Today we're exploring the first time someone cheated. Why did it happen? How did it feel? What they told themselves in the moment, and what came after. And how do people make sense of that first betrayal? Whether they were the one who cheated or the one who was cheated on. To help us unpack this conversation, we're joined by Dr. Rachael Needle, a licensed psychologist, certified sex therapist, educator, and media expert. She is the founder and CEO of the Advanced Mental Health Training Institute, co-founding director of Modern Sex Therapy Institute, and an adjunct professor at Nova Southeastern University. Dr. Needle's work focuses on relationships, sexuality, sexual functioning trauma, and the complex dynamics that shape human connection. Today, she'll help us explore the emotional, relational, and psychological dimensions of infidelity, why people cross boundaries, how they make sense of those choices, and what happens in the aftermath. Hello, Dr. Rachael. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a great topic.
So, Dr. Rachael, when I hear the word cheating, many people immediately picture a physical or sexual affair, but infidelity can take many forms, and I think that distinction matters. What actually counts as cheating, and why do so many couples discover they have very different answers to the question?
I tell couples that cheating isn't defined by a single behavior. It's defined by broken agreements and broken trust. So for one couple, kissing can cross the line, and for others, that's in line. For another, it could be emotional intimacy, sexting, or any texting, anything that's hidden, pornography. So the biggest problem is that most couples don't actually have these conversations. And that's the biggest problem because they assume that their partner's definition is going to be the same as their definition of cheating. And that, well, this is obvious, so this person should know. But what's obvious to one person is not necessarily obvious to another. So one day we might think, I didn't think I was cheating. And another person one day might think, that absolutely was cheating, because infidelity does exist on a spectrum. There's physical affairs, there's emotional affairs, there's now digital affairs, there's financial infidelity, there's secrecy. So the most important thing is that you have these conversations with your partner or partners and you define your own boundaries, your own agreements. The common denominator for cheating is not sex, it's deception. Investing energy, our intimacy, resources outside of our primary relationship if that's not agreed upon. So have the conversations, communicate with your partner or partners, and that is the way that you make sure you're on the same page about what cheating is, what's okay, what's not okay.
I also think that there's a difference between someone who cheats repeatedly and someone who experiences that first moment crossing the boundary, the first lie, the first secret, the first decision to hide something. What makes that first act of infidelity psychologically significant?
I think the first act of infidelity is rarely the kiss or the sexual encounter. Psychologically, it often begins with the first decision to cross a boundary and keep it a secret. So, the first text that you delete, the first conversation that you hide, maybe the first time you think, I probably shouldn't tell my partner about this moment. So we begin to compartmentalize. So once someone justifies a first secret, it often becomes easier to justify another. It's important, again, that we talk, but that also we recognize in ourselves when we start crossing different lines within our relationships. Affairs typically don't happen overnight. There are a lot of like small decisions that slowly normalize a behavior. And remember that the first infidelity or cheating rarely begins as a physical betrayal. That's not to say that it never happens. It absolutely does. Many affairs do develop gradually, their emotional closeness, a series of small boundary crossings, but some are definitely opportunistic. They happen because of convenience, availability. Alcohol is a big one, travel, anonymity. So, someone's on a business trip and they're drinking at the bar and something happens. Maybe it's a moment of poor judgment. So they happen for different reasons. I think there's a couple things that are important. We sometimes think that it just happens, one time or in one instance. We think of it as something, sometimes we might think of it as slowly happening over months of flirting. Not always true. Some are the result of emotional drifts, opportunity, again, a business trip. But whether it's an impulsive decision or a slow progression, what matters is how we heal after the affair and what comes next. Some people think, oh, well, we need full transparency. I'm not one that thinks that, but we definitely can't move on if we don't understand why the affair happened. We have to take accountability, rebuild trust, not necessarily just apologize and move on.
You mentioned the different ways that it could happen. So I'd like us now to kind of segue into some of the myths around cheating. The first one being that people cheat because they don't love their partner. And I
Yes.
think this is probably one of the most common assumptions, even for the person who's being cheated on, that if someone cheats, it automatically means they no longer love the person they're with. But relationships are complicated, as you've mentioned. So is infidelity always evidence that love is gone, or can other factors be driving the behavior?
No, absolutely not. That is absolutely one of the biggest myths of infidelity. But the reality is so much more complex, right? People can genuinely love their partner and still make decisions that deeply hurt them. We do that every day. Love by itself is not what protects a relationship. The things that protect a relationship are integrity, communication, emotional regulation, having healthy boundaries, communication, and commitment to the relationship. There's so many different reasons why people cheat, and not loving their partner is not necessarily one of them. People have strayed for years and years for different reasons. There's no one reason that people end up cheating or straying from their relationships. Each relationship is going to be, and reason is going to be unique. Again, opportunity, anger, curiosity, substance abuse, novelty, validation, impulsivity, adventure seeking, boredom, there's revenge. There are so many reasons why people may be unfaithful to their partner. And again, we need to understand those things. And some people sometimes think understanding is justification or excusing a behavior, but we can have compassion for the factors that led and contributed to someone's behavior while still holding them accountable for that behavior, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And you mentioned also that it's important, of course, to have a conversation and to define what cheating means to each person. For example, I come from a country where polygamy is legal.
Yep.
So, I mean, even if someone is married to one person, as an example, if they cheat, we have sayings even in my language that, a man belongs to more than one woman. So I think it's important, like you say, to have that conversation because sometimes culture can play a role too, right?
You're bringing up an important point. Can we love more than one person? And that is also possible, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody does or everybody can. There are people that can be in love with multiple people, polyamory, people that choose to love and do love more than one person. And love and betrayal are not mutually exclusive. We can love somebody and still hurt them. Human beings are so complex as our emotions, and our behavior is not always consistent with our feelings.
And then there's another myth that cheating is always premeditated. People imagine that cheating is something that's carefully planned, but sometimes we hear stories where it's often messier, moments escalate, boundaries slowly shift, and decisions don't feel like decisions until after you've actually cheated. How do people find themselves crossing boundaries they never thought they would cross?
I mean, I think it's so important to recognize that there isn't one path to infidelity. There are some affairs that are absolutely planned and intentional. Others just develop gradually over time. Some are impulsive, driven by opportunity or poor judgment. And we need to know that human behavior is rarely a one size fits all. So, for a lot of people, it's just a series of increasingly blurred boundaries. A conversation might become more personal, or we might start texting people more. And I know we're going to talk about technology later, but that's absolutely another area that we haven't had conversations about. And that can easily lead to blurred lines that develop in a way that we don't expect them to if we're not careful and if we don't have these conversations. One reason people are surprised by their behavior often is that we tend to overestimate our ability to resist temptation. We often think, that won't be me. I could never do that. But when we stop paying attention to our boundaries or put ourselves in situations where our judgment may be impaired, we can make decisions that don't always align with our values. So it's important to make decisions beforehand about what's going to be okay, what's not okay, what positions we're going to put ourselves in, and when it's important to leave or excuse ourselves from situations that could go in a different place. And I think the lesson isn't to become fearful of every interaction with another person. It's absolutely to know what our own vulnerabilities are, to communicate openly with our partners about it, and to protect the boundaries that protect our relationships. Healthy relationships aren't maintained or sustained by good intentions alone. They're sustained by intentional and consistent choices.
So, speaking of choices, another myth is that the person who cheats doesn't feel guilty, like, oh, you cheated, so you made the choice. We think of them as selfish, that they didn't even think twice. But when we hear some of the stories from others, it's far more complicated, as you've already mentioned. So, what are emotional experiences that people commonly report after cheating for the first time?
Yeah, so many. I'm glad you brought this up because one of the biggest misconceptions is that people that cheat don't have a conscience. But in reality, people experience tremendous guilt. Not everybody, but most and a lot. They experience shame, anxiety, and so much internal conflict, especially after the first time. There's an important distinction to make between guilt and shame. Guilt is, I did something bad. Shame is, I'm a bad person. And so I think that when it comes to guilt, it can motivate somebody to take responsibility and to repair damage. But shame often leads people to hide and deny and avoid consequences. Not everyone reacts the same way, but most will have some response. It's not that they don't have a conscience and they just go on thinking this is fine and everything's okay and I'm okay. Most have some emotional feelings that come with the being unfaithful. That doesn't mean that they don't compartmentalize or rationalize. That's a way that some people will reduce their discomfort. But, that doesn't always happen right away. But there's a range of reactions and emotions that come with being unfaithful.
So then I guess the follow-up question would be, why continue? You've made the distinction between guilt and shame. If you feel guilty, okay, then the assumption is that you will rectify this behavior.
Yeah.
So yeah. Why continue?
Yeah. And that's a great question too. So, feeling guilty doesn't automatically make someone trustworthy. People continue for the same reason they started. They may feel badly that they're betraying their partner or feel guilty, but they're still having differences in their sexual desires at home or with their primary partner, and they don't have conversations about it and choose to just do something else. They may be angry at their partner. They may continuously be in situations where there's opportunity and less likely to get caught. They might still continue doing things even though it doesn't feel good. Think of other things that people do that don't make them feel good. Sometimes people will eat something and it doesn't agree with their stomach, but they'll still eat it again because the positive of it tasting good outweighed their stomach ache after. And similar things can happen with being unfaithful. You may not feel good about it and you may feel guilty, but that strong desire to feel good or, have immediate gratification or do something that validates you outweighs the feeling badly.
It's like cheese. Cheese if you're lactose intolerant.
Right. Actually, I was literally thinking about that one. And I recently was told I have to go off dairy for a little while. And I'm like, okay, well, after the 3 months, I still might eat ice cream once in a while.
Exactly. So, Dr. Needle, you mentioned that cheating doesn't always start with a sexual act. There's the before the kiss, before the physical encounter, the secrecy, deleting messages, withholding information, telling half truths, creating this private world that someone else isn't allowed to see. So why is secrecy such a powerful part of infidelity? And what happens psychologically when people begin to live two realities at once?
Secrecy is so powerful. And one of the reasons is because it separates privacy and deception. Everybody deserves privacy in their relationship. Secrecy is a whole different story. Secrecy involves intentionally withholding information because it would matter to your partner, because it would upset your partner, because it violates agreements that you've made with a partner. And when someone begins to live two realities, it takes an enormous amount of mental and emotional energy. It is not an easy thing to do. You have to remember what you've said to who. You have to manage the fear of being discovered and constantly justify your behavior to yourself. That compartmentalization creates internal conflict. They may be physically present when they're with a partner, but emotionally invested somewhere else, which can disconnect you from a partner, and that often grows over time. For the betrayed partner, the deepest wound is often realizing that their partner has a whole nother part of themselves that they don't know and that they didn't know existed. It's not just that the affair they're grieving, it's the loss of that shared reality with a partner. So they might start asking themselves, what else don't I know? That's where trust is just profoundly broken in that situation. Not everyone who keeps a secret is having an affair, and not every private thought is a betrayal. So again, the issue isn't privacy, it's deception.
I'm also curious about the stories that people tell themselves, because very few people wake up and say, today I'm going to be a villain and hurt my partner. So what are some of the common ways that people justify infidelity to themselves?
I just want to say one more thing I just thought of for the last question, and then I'll address that if that's okay. I think a lot of people, again, think that when trust is broken, it's broken. But the good news is that trust can be rebuilt in the exact opposite way that it was broken. So not through, some people think, one grand gesture that if I do this, it'll rebuild, but through consistent honesty, you know, little small moments where your actions match your words and where you're choosing to adhere to the boundaries and agreements that you've set. So I just thought that that was important to say because I don't want it to sound like once it's gone, it's gone. So your question, the stories you tell ourselves. One of the things that we know from psychology is that people are good at protecting their self-image. People don't necessarily wake up one day intending like, today's the day I'm going to betray my partner. They create narratives gradually along the way that make their behavior seem more acceptable. They might say to themselves, well, my needs haven't been met for years, or we're basically roommates, or this is just flirting, so it's harmless and I deserve to be happy. Some of these feelings can be very real, but someone may also feel genuinely lonely, rejected, disconnected, all of these things, but that itself doesn't justify betrayal. But these are some of the stories we might tell ourselves. We morally rationalize. So we adjust the story maybe to tell ourselves that our behaviors feel consistent with who we are and that we deserve them. People rarely justify infidelity by saying, I'm doing something wrong. They justify them by convincing themselves that they're doing something understandable. So they tell themselves these stories to make it more okay and so that they can live with themselves as they're doing it. Again, when I'm talking, I am generalizing. Everybody chooses and is unfaithful for different reasons. There are general commonalities, but also there are people that feel differently following infidelity than others. So I'm generalizing, and I just think that's important to mention.
You touched a bit on technology, which of course has changed the landscape completely. Today, emotional affairs can begin through social media, old flames, reconnecting, private conversations that can continue around the clock. And sometimes people find themselves emotionally invested in someone they've never even met. So how has technology changed our understanding of infidelity, boundaries, and emotional intimacy?
This is so important. And I think the biggest question of the day, because the truth is that technology hasn't changed the fundamental psychology of infidelity, but it has dramatically changed the opportunities for connection, temptation, and secrecy. So, 20 years ago, an affair often required planning. Today, we can connect with an old high school sweetheart, start a private conversation with a coworker, or develop a more deep emotional bond with someone that's across the world even, right? Just from the privacy of the computer that's in front of me or, my phone on the couch. So I think that technology has blurred the lines between friendship, between flirting and emotional intimacy. Again, even a more important reason to have detailed conversations with your partner or partners about what counts as cheating to you? What boundaries are yours and what are your partner's? What is okay and not okay? So if we're in a relationship, it might be okay with me for you to have friends that are ex-lovers or partners, for you to have conversations. And for you, you might not be comfortable with that. So we need to know and make decisions together about what's okay and not okay and what we're comfortable adhering to and being okay with ourselves. Is it cheating to message an ex? Maybe, maybe not. But if you're turning to someone else for emotional support, for validation, or for intimacy in ways that you're hiding from your partner, it's likely that you've crossed that relational boundary. Even if, like you said, you've never met the person. I think it's important because people often ask, are online relationships real? And, from a psychological perspective, the truth is that the brain doesn't make that distinction nearly as much as we think we do. Emotional attachment, anticipation, excitement, longing, the impact on a relationship can be just as real regardless.
So while it's not physical, I suppose if you feel you have to hide it, then maybe you need to do some introspection and figure
Right,
out
and
why.
also what you're getting from it. Like, what is the motivation from what you're doing? Am I genuinely interested in, Mary Jane, how are you doing? I just wanted to see how you're doing, catch up. Or are you now becoming somebody that I invest time in, emotional energy, that I'm sharing emotional things with, especially about my partner? And, ask yourself if every message did or interaction did appear on a screen in front of your partner, would I feel comfortable? Would I feel okay? Would I be okay if my partner was doing this? But also, again, having those conversations is key because Technology has changed and made access easier, but it hasn't changed the importance of honesty. If I'm investing time and energy with a coworker and talking about my relationship, that's similar to if I'm doing that online. Just because they're in person doesn't make it different. Again, having lunch with a coworker isn't the same as having lunch with them every day and then sharing important personal information with them in a way that has me relying on them or confiding in them in a way that's creating a deep emotional connection, especially if I notice that I'm having different types of feelings towards them or different kinds of attraction towards them.
Of course, for some couples, infidelity ends a relationship, and you've touched a bit on the
Yes.
possibility to reverse the deception. For others, of course, it becomes a transformative conversation and they start to work together to heal. So, what determines whether a relationship can recover from infidelity, and what does genuine repair actually look like?
So, an affair doesn't automatically end the relationship and it doesn't automatically make one stronger either, but I've seen both happen. What determines the outcome is less about the affair itself and more about how partners respond afterwards. So, repair definitely begins with full accountability, not being defensive, not minimizing, not blaming the relationship or the betrayed partner. You have to be willing to say, I'm choosing you, I hurt you, and I'm willing to do the work. But repair involves all participating parties, not just the one that was unfaithful. The betrayed partner will likely need time to grieve. And we also have to know that infidelity isn't always something that is interpreted as relationship trauma, but likely the betrayed partner's sense of safety, reality, trust has been shattered. So it gradually needs to become something that they are able to get back. The emotional security, the safety, and for all partners involved. I think we don't need to necessarily say, okay, you're the cheater and you're the cheated on. This is a relationship issue. Repair involves all parties involved. Repair requires things like curiosity, not one that again excuses the betrayal, but curiosity does help answer the question of how did we get here? What led to this? So understanding the why, not to justify the behavior, but to reduce likelihood that it happens again and help all parties kind of in the relationship get through it. Trust is lost in moments, but repair takes patterns, it takes time, it takes understanding. Again, I've said earlier, it's not just a grand behavior, but it's consistency. So I've seen relationships end after infidelity, and I've seen relationships become the strongest and healthiest that they've ever been. Not because the affair was a gift, right? It wasn't, but because it forced conversations and honesty and personal growth that had been avoided or never had happened before. I want people to know that recovery is possible. It requires all partners involved willing to have different kinds of conversations, to work hard, to rebuild the trust, and to become willing to choose and risk that trust over and over again. I think it's important. Some people say that rebuilding trust takes transparency. It might take some transparency in different areas, but we have to understand that there is still a difference between privacy and secrecy. We're not entitled to every thought that our partners has. And that's the difference. But it does require consistency, honesty, doing what you say you're going to do in moments that are not sexually or emotional intimacy related. And all of these things, again, can help make your relationship so much stronger that some people don't even realize that having a relationship so great was possible. Infidelity is going to be different, but know that it is possible to continue with your current partner and make the relationship better and healthier. And for some, that's just not going to be possible. But having that conversation and deciding together what's possible is what's most important. And sometimes you need help doing that with somebody like a psychologist, someone who specializes in this involved.
So you mentioned the difference between privacy and transparency. And I
Yes.
wonder, because sometimes the person who's been betrayed may feel like, oh, I want you to tell me everything. This is the only way that we move forward. And if you can't tell me everything, then I don't know if you can rebuild. So what do you say to someone who feels negative about the act itself towards their partner, and also who feels like now you just need to tell me everything?
So what is everything, right? Because everything is never possible. Do I have to tell you when I have to go to the bathroom? Do I have to tell you, what I ate for lunch? So I think it's important for people to define what's important to them to know, because otherwise it's going to lead to distrust anyway. So while certain types of transparency might be important in the beginning, obviously, there has to be an end to that eventually. It can't be for the rest of the 50 years of your life if that's what you have. There has to be a time where trust is built to the point where, again, you understand the agreements, which a lot of times there's not an understanding of them, but that you also begin to trust over time. In that time, be specific about what you're needing and understand why you're needing it. Again, if it was something that you realize there was a part of your partner's life that you just didn't know, then there are going to be things that are more important to you to know than others. I don't need to know every time you have a conversation with people, but it would be important for me to know X, Y, and Z. Or for us to have a conversation at the end of the day about what was encountered or what felt different to us, to be honest with yourself in terms of if there's something you're wanting to withhold, because that might then be something you're wanting to share. But there also has to be an agreement about how a partner responds, how everybody in the relationship responds to things, and to how you have these conversations. Going to a different side of what you asked is there are people that say, I want to know every detail of every affair that happened, down to what type of underwear they were wearing and what position. And I would caution people against that. I understand why that might seem important. I would say definitely be with a therapist that specializes in this so that there's a way to unfold it and get everything back in a container so that you're not leaving freaking out. You are not entitled to every second of every day asking a question whenever it comes in your mind. You have to then be more emotionally regulated than that. That is not going to rebuild a relationship and make it stronger. Again, I totally understand why you want to be able to do it, but there has to be a container where there's a time of day that is allotted for these questions, and you have to be able to hold it in and maybe write it in a journal or talk to somebody else about it until that time of day is there. And you need to be able to say that these are the things that are my boundaries. These are the things that are important to me, and stick to them. But not every detail is going to be healthy to know about. Most people will take that and just have these images in their head forever. So do some hard work with your own therapist maybe around that to understand that before you request that, and then decide together what's okay and what's not okay for both of your mental health. Because ultimately, if the goal is to try to make the relationship work, there are some things that are going to make this worse, and we don't want to go there.
So, in closing, what is the one thing that you would want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
There's a couple things, if that's okay, that affairs don't necessarily happen for one reason, and that it's important to understand what's going on with you in the relationship at all times. I encourage people to have relationship check-ins often and, have conversations on an ongoing basis about what the relationship agreements are so that you will all know when you're breaking them and you know what's okay and what's not okay. And I think lastly, that affairs don't automatically end a relationship and that they can be stronger as a result of that relationship. It does sometimes require grieving of the relationship you once had and of what happened, but that repair is possible and relationships can come out healthier and stronger even after a betrayal. And one more thing I thought of is that, the truth is it's easy for me to say, let's say, if my partner cheated on me, I'd leave. But that hasn't happened. And most people don't leave is the truth after, infidelity. They do say they do work on the relationship. So be careful who you share things with and who you talk to because they won't always understand. And it's so easy for somebody on the outside to say, you should leave and I would never stay. But the truth is, as is true with other situations, is we don't always know how we would handle it. So decide who you're going to find as support and make sure they're actually people that can be supportive regardless of what you decide to do.
Thank you, Dr. Needle. I like that you really need to be careful who you share your story around relationships with, because it's true. A lot of us are very judgmental and we will say, you have to leave, the person betrayed you. So thank you so much. And I hope that our listeners can resonate with what we've talked about, and hopefully it's helpful in their relationships.
I hope so as well. And if anyone needs to reach out to me, you're welcome to. You can find me at drrachel.com or on social media at Dr. Rachael Needle on Instagram and everywhere else except Facebook is Dr. Rachel. And people can feel free to reach out to me, drrachelneedle at gmail.com.
Thank you so much. Dr. Needle mentioned that cheating isn't defined by a single behavior. It's defined by broken agreements and broken trust. And our listener story today captures just that, the complexities that come with infidelity and how uncomfortable it can be to talk about. Perhaps because it forces us to confront contradictions between love and betrayal, commitment and desire, and the relationship we thought we had versus the reality we're suddenly forced to face. Take a listen.
So I was married for 9 years and had been with him for only about a year and a half before we got married. Prior to dating him, I was in a relationship with a guy who was cheating on me a lot. So when I met him, he seemed very safe and like the kind of guy who would never cheat on you. And because I was so run down from that previous relationship, my standards were very low. And I was just looking for somebody stable and stability. And so he came off that way. He came off like the kind of guy who would never cheat on you and that this could be something long lasting. But he hid a lot of himself in that year and a half of being together. And I was working a job that was like 90 hours a week. So I didn't fully focus on who is this person. People are able to mask who they really are for quite a while. So in retrospect, I should have not gotten married as fast as I did. Within 6 months of dating, he asked me to marry him. And then it was, once you tell the family that, it's all go. I wish I would have known him better and longer so I could have seen that mask come down. Because it wasn't until we were married that he had told me that he was in a previous relationship that lasted 9 years. And instead of just breaking up that relationship, he's from Europe, he moved to the United States, said he was going to have her come. And instead of breaking up with her, he cheated on her. And then that relationship ended. I didn't know any of this when we were dating. I didn't know any of this until we were already married. But the relationship was pretty rocky the whole time. It is a little bit of a cliche, but also can be true that once a cheater, always a cheater. Ended up being true in my case. So with me, again, I chose him because I thought he would always be stable, he'd always be loyal. He seemed to really love me and all of that. So fast forward later, we have a child, and he is a professor in a medical environment, teaching postgrad students, so adults. And he would always surround himself with young women. So most of the people he hired for his lab were young, attractive women. And whenever we would throw some sort of get together or a party for any reason, and he would invite his lab, it would always be this horde of women who would kind of follow him around. And I remember just saying, like, are you being good? Like, haha, joke, joke. He's like, of course I am. So I had suspicions early on, but nothing substantial. So we move forward in the relationship. We have a child. So I had that suspicion almost the entire marriage after hearing about the relationship that he had. But it was just kind of in the back of my mind. There was nothing overt in front of me. So until, again, with him, it was so cliche. He started to want to work out more. He was saying things like, "Oh, why don't we take separate vacations? Like, you can go with our daughter and I will stay here." I was trying to work on the marriage. We were already really rocky and not really fully understanding. His way of working on the marriage was working on himself separate of the marriage. So to me, that wasn't really working on the marriage. He had other issues, like he wasn't capable of considering that I exist. Like he would go to the grocery store and get things for himself and not think to himself, well, hey, what does my wife and daughter also need since I'm here? Never. He could never do that. Whereas I was the opposite. Like I couldn't possibly think about going to the store and not going like, what does my daughter need? What does my husband need? And that was just kind of how he always was. So I think it got even worse because in our relationship, we stopped having sex, mostly because he couldn't perform. And apparently that is something that happened in the relationship he had prior, that longer relationship of 9 years. We started sleeping in separate beds because he wanted to be on a different time than me. So, I mean, all of the writing was sort of on the wall. So before getting into this relationship, and what I used to say to him of like, if you ever cheat on me, I would leave you. Like I'm not good with that. Like no cheating. So as the relationship continued to kind of go downhill, there was one time I was away for a business trip and we actually had a property that we would go to on the weekends. And he asked me, "Oh, I want to take these few women from my lab." And these were young women in their 20s. And I said, "Well, that's really inappropriate if I'm not there." So he was looking to spend time with these women when I'm not around. Anytime there was a work event where there was some sort of Christmas party or what have you, he would lie to me and tell me that spouses weren't allowed to go. He at one point even told me the reason why he didn't want me to go to his lab is because he was embarrassed by me, which is a horrible thing to hear from someone you're married to. And again, in retrospect, it's like, yeah, it's because he wanted to be around one woman or another. So I don't know for sure if he had multiple relationships during that 9 years. I can tell you about the last one. So the last one where it was really obvious he was wanting to, like I said, work out all the time. He wanted a whole new wardrobe and was changing the way that he was dressing, sleeping in a separate bedroom. And I think when it really was obvious was he normally would come home at a certain time, relieve our babysitter, and then I would come home a little later. Our schedules were this way. And I came home and he wasn't there, and the babysitter was like, "I have to leave." And we found that my daughter had lice, which is, if anybody has kids and ever has that, it's a big deal. It's a lot of work because you have to strip everything and what have you. If you're with a partner, you usually do this together. And he said, "Oh, well, I'm hanging out. Somebody just got awarded their PhD, one of my students, and we're out with them." And I said, "Well, you tell them you have to go home. Your daughter has lice. We have to deal with this." And he just wouldn't come home. What I later learned is the person who got their PhD was a woman he was having a relationship with. So he was having a relationship with one of his students. In fact, he was the person responsible for granting her PhD, which is obviously very inappropriate. So that happened probably a little less than a year before we actually separated, because he told me later that was when it started. They weren't actually at a party. They were out, just the two of them, walking through New York City, hand in hand kind of thing. And he wouldn't come home to his family who needed him. So he did admit that to me later. I do think by telling him early on in the relationship that if he cheated, that would be it, I would leave, I think that almost aided in why he cheated, because I think he wanted out of the relationship. And instead of just talking to me about it and confronting it head on and respectfully, I think by cheating. And then I can tell you, like, he would drop little hints here and there and eventually led me to see the relationship. He wouldn't even tell me that he was cheating. Like, he wanted me to be the one to basically leave him so that he doesn't have to do any of the quote dirty work or ever be at fault for anything. Eventually kind of found out that this something for sure was happening. We were working at this second home on 2 different computers. And I have a Mac, he has a Windows. I needed a piece of software that only could run on Windows. So I asked, can I use your computer? He said, yes. I got on his computer to install the software. And when the computer came out of hibernation, what was up on the screen was Skype. I mean, this is how long ago this was. This was the Skype era. And there was an entire text thread right there in front of me between him and her. And then he sat there and let me read it. Like, I really do think he wanted me to find out. And it was very obvious from this particular Skype that he's very much pursuing her and telling her about our daughter and all of this stuff. And she was the only one who mentioned that I exist. He wouldn't admit that it was anything more than an emotional affair. And so then came the discussion of, like, what do we do from here? That moment when I was finding this out, his parents were actually visiting from abroad, staying in the house with us. Instead of dealing with it, he decided to get in the car and drive back to New York City and leave me alone in the house with his parents, which is very, very awkward. And his parents are the kind of parents that he can do no wrong. He's on a pedestal. He's never been held accountable for anything. So, of course, this all has to be my fault. And that's the way he always made it at that time and also throughout the divorce process. But initially, after the shock of seeing this, and he kept saying, oh, I haven't done anything physical with her, I found that I did not want to have a broken marriage because of my daughter. So my initial feeling when we got married and during the beginning of the relationship was one way, but then once I have a child and all the responsibilities that come along with that, I was like, we should try to work this out, especially if what he was saying was true and that it was only an emotional thing and he wasn't like in love with her or anything. I ended up taking a few weeks off of work to be like the perfect wife, like clean the house, make him dinner, be more physical with him when we could. And after that period of time, he said to me, okay, I really want to work this out. And what I later learned, it was because during that time period, she finished her PhD. She's also from abroad. And she had to go back to her country, so she wasn't physically there. But then he helped her get a job, even though he had promised me he was not going to have a relationship at all with her, talk to her at all. He got her a job back at the hospital that he worked at and helped her get a work permit. So he initially said to me, yes, I want to work this out. But then after getting her back in the country and back working directly with him, then he drifted away very fast. And I didn't know because he had recommitted himself to me. He started buying concert tickets. And I'd be like, oh, you bought concert tickets. Like, great, yay. And, you know, assuming there's 2 tickets, we would go together, right? We're married. It's been 9 years. And then later he said, well, I didn't know if we'd still be together by the time of the concert. And I was like, what do you mean? I was like, what do you mean we wouldn't be together? So even though he was still telling me we were going to be together, we were going to be there for my daughter, he wasn't going to talk to her, all of that again was a lie. I don't have any communication with him now. It's been 10 years since this part of the story I'm telling you. So I don't have a conversation with him at all about any of this stuff. I don't know for sure how much he was lying. But what I do know is how it eventually worked out is even though I was really trying to fight for a relationship, trying to be almost like this person I wasn't, like a trad wife in today's terminology. Is that going to make a difference? Like doing everything because he kept making me feel like it was all my fault. And because of my upbringing, I'm very sensitive to blame and like proving that I'm not to blame and fixing whatever it is that I supposedly did wrong. But at the end of the day, it happened again where About a month after he said we're going to stay together, his computer was open, unlocked. I was just cleaning the kitchen. Look, I'm a computer person. If I really wanted to dig into all of his stuff and open his phone, I don't need anybody to help me do that. I could have done that, but I wasn't seeking out, like, is he still doing it? I was trying to take his word for it. But again, he kept leaving the stuff right in front of me. So he left his computer open, unlocked, and then he was messaging her. And because he had Skype on his phone and Skype on the computer was beep, 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 beep. So I went over to kind of like stop whatever the beeping was to finish cleaning the kitchen. And there it was again, him messaging the girl. And in this time, the messages were the kind of let's be together kind of messages. I don't want to be a marriage. I'm going to leave my wife kind of thing. And you're like, you're going to what? I found out he was messaging short-term leases, that he had planned to just leave us and go stay someplace else. And again, the whole time he was still telling me, we're working this out. I'm not talking to the girl. When I found those messages, especially the ones that he said that he was actually arranging to move out to another apartment, like within a few days, I was like, what is this? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, so what were you going to do? Just like not be here someday? He's like, yes. It was just insane. They just left. He wanted half of everything. He even took like half of Ziploc bags that were made only for my daughter. And what I know in retrospect is he went to a temporary place, a sublease for like a month or two, and then he moved in with this girl, and then he lied about it when we started going through the divorce process, saying that he lived alone, which wasn't true. He has not seen his daughter now for 9 years, has decided to have no contact with her. And I believe to this day, he's still with that woman. Within a year of leaving me, they had a baby. Within a few months of leaving me, when you're not supposed to change your will or anything during the divorce process, he changed his will to give everything to this woman and cut his own daughter out of his will. So in retrospect, I don't believe that during that time it was just an emotional cheating. Either that or that's just the way he moves, that he tries to sweep up somebody very, very fast, kind of like he did with me, with the love bombing and all of that. Maybe he did with this woman. But I do think he might still be together with her, but we'll see. It's been over the 9-year mark. So 9 years with his other ex, 9 years with me. With them, it might be 10. So maybe this is the one for him. I don't know. Obviously, it's changed me completely. I instantly became a single mom, and that was never a planned thing when it happened in a snap. So my life was already focused on my daughter, but with another partner, you can kind of split things up and have just a little bit to yourself. But as a single parent, like forget it. Everything is about your child. So in that regards, like my career stopped. I'm still in the same roles as I was at that time. I focus on my daughter. I learned about a year later that she's on the spectrum. And so my focus is and was during that time to get her a good education, to help her with any supports, and also help her still have a great self-esteem because she's a great kid, and all of that. And of course, we had the pandemic. And as a single parent with a special needs child, I think that nearly broke us all. So yeah, it changed my life completely to become a single mom where you're just focused on your child at that point. Dating and all of that, I dabbled a little bit a few years after, but he also sent me through a 7-year divorce process, which sent me into depression and almost financially bankrupt me. So the last thing you want to do when you're going through something like that is put any energy towards anybody else. It's like I put energy towards my daughter, and if I have any left, I have to put it into this divorce process. And that went on for 7 years. So it's only been now 3 years since that concluded. So that sucked the life out of me. In general, I'm not really focused on finding a partner, as now my daughter is a teenager. Of course, I'm still focused on her, and I'm just focused on me. And now that I have a little more time and she's a little older, and sometimes that just means doing nothing, just like resting. I don't have the energy. It sounds really sad because it would be great to have a partner in life and share experiences with, but I don't have the energy to start something new. I am naturally now just completely distrusting of most men. The biggest lesson is Pay attention to actions, not words. Pay attention to the past actions of the person. But at the same time, obviously, not everyone is going to repeat their mistakes, but a lot of people do. So just kind of protect yourself. At one point, to save the marriage, I was considering moving out of the city, leaving my job, becoming 100% dependent on him in a new role, because he used to tell me, oh, I would be nicer to you if we didn't live in New York City. It's so stressful here. I'm really glad in retrospect I didn't do that, because I wouldn't have had my own career. I wouldn't be able to support my daughter. That would have been a real mess. I'm glad I didn't give that part of myself up to try to save him, because what he was telling me was not true. He wouldn't have been nicer to me. I think also try not to blame yourself, because I've done that. I still have dreams where I do that. Like somehow I can fix things, even though I would never want to be with him again. It still shows up in my dreams. I think another thing is, if you're going through this yourself, it's okay to change your mind about how you want to react to it, because you may have one feeling at the beginning of the relationship, at the middle of the relationship. If you have children, if you have dependent parents, like whatever your situation is, it may change. In my situation, trying to work it out did not work out, but in other people's, it could. So I guess what I would tell others is, don't listen to others. Do what you feel is right for you. If it's right for you to say, no, I'm leaving, that's it. If it feels right to you to say, I'm going to give this a go, I'm going to try, do what you have to do for you and try to block out the noise of other people. The only advice I would really give is to get a therapist for yourself, because sometimes it's easier to work through really how you're feeling about something when you're able to kind of echo off your words off of someone who's a professional.
If this episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear about it. Email us on sexualencounterstheveryfirst@gmail.com, or you can DM us at Let's Talk First. You're listening to Sexual Encounters, the very first time.